Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Managing Organisational Change and Handling Redundancies webinar with Savant and HR Department. I hope you're all well. My name is Mark Sheldon. I'm the founder and MD of Savant. Savant is a finance and technology search specialist that also delivers executive coaching as well as talented people. In a few minutes, I'll introduce formally to my co-presenter, Camilla Woodrow. But first, why don't we set the agenda for the day? If we looking at the slide, we've got 4 key topic areas: organisational change, developing a business rationale, a fair redundancy process, and continuing to retain and motivate your team. After each of these 4 topics, we'll take some questions. You can see online that you have the ability, hopefully, to ask questions. You'll also note that support documents have already been loaded into the webinar handout section. You can download them as appropriate during the course of the webinar. We'll also take 2 brief polls at different sections to get your opinion on a couple of things, and also you'll be invited to offer your feedback at the end of the event. So it's hopefully as interactive as we can be with the webinar. Your support and questions really make this work and are the benefit for everybody else. Finally, on the introductions, Savant and the HR department have provided their services free of charge today. However, that we would request that you make a donation to our nominated charity, which is Action for Children. Even a £10 difference donation will make a difference. I'm vice chair of the Bike Night charity, which is a large sleep out event that supports Action for Children. Over 100,000 children and young adults unfortunately sleep rough in the UK every year, and at this point with COVID and the lack of funding and the lack of charity donations, that's become even more thrown more into crisis. So every year a group of us across the UK, probably about 1,500 business professionals, sleep out to raise money for charity or for Action for Children. So again, all your funds, any donations you make will go to this cause and will greatly help homeless children. So let's move on. Let's return back to the webinar topic of organisational change. Speed and agility and a new understanding of customer values are the keys to navigating our way through to the new normal. COVID-19 continues to have a far-reaching effect on people's lives, families, as well as the economy. Amid the bleak economic reality, I suppose, companies are now focused on driving a dual agenda, with protecting lives and jobs and protecting livelihoods. As the crisis continues, many companies are struggling to understand its full impact on their business, but what they are doing is taking steps to how best to respond. In a recent McKinsey survey, circa 25%, over a quarter of the companies surveyed, said that they are redirecting and increasing spend towards emerging opportunities rather than existing structures. They state in their article, Leading with Purpose, leaders need to operate simultaneously across 3 horizons: navigating the crisis now, planning for recovery, and leading into the next normal. I suppose if we look back, when the pandemic erupted, many businesses, as usual, approaches failed or would have failed if it wasn't for government support. Businesses have had to increase the speed of decision making while improving productivity and using technology and data in new ways. I think it's just fair to say it's working. Many organisations from a wide range of sectors have accomplished difficult tasks and achieved positive results in record times. These things that they've achieved include redeploying talent, launching new business models, improving productivity, and shifting operations. So I don't think at this point it's fair. There's no chance of turning back. We're on a journey. We're already well down the path. What we have to do is having one, if we can create one fast agile team, it becomes helpful in a business, but having many of those agile teams across an enterprise, enabling them with the right structures, the right processes and cultures, means the business will be able to move faster and quicker and adapt to what is the new norm. So restructuring, reorganizing, and engaging with new technology is paramount to the success and survival of a business. What is the new revenue norm? A question that we get asked a lot at the moment. Many of our customers are trying to find that out. They're trying to establish where their new revenue norm sits. Another McKinsey's article, There's No Going Back, shows obviously there's a slowdown, there's a slow return to a new normal. The decisions we'll have to take now will set the performance trajectory for the business in the next few years. Okay, so the decisions we're making now, the structures we put into place, will set the trajectory of the business for the next few years. The shift to remote working, the use of digital technologies, leads us to reimagine how our own businesses, but also most importantly, our customers will operate. While it's too early to predict the full impact of COVID-19, over a third of all the executives McKinsey surveyed expected a muted recovery at best. They said that they expected a drop of over 11% GDP across the Eurozone and not a full recovery until late 2023. This means that for many of us, there'll be a sharp drop in revenue and a squeeze on capital, but and a hit on the return on the equity return. So if we look at the 6 imperatives to survive, we need to innovate new products, we need to reshape physical distribution of labor, we need to build a leaner, scalable business model, we need to focus on speed and agility of the organization to respond to new opportunities, we need to recognize the importance of risk and capital management, and finally, mergers and acquisitions. These will play a role. It does remain a path to economies of scale, cost savings, and acquiring new skills. So hence the need for the webinar, Managing Organizational Change. So it's now, I will introduce you to Camilla. Camilla is an Associate Director with the HR department. She has over 20 years HR experience. She's CIPD qualified and has multi-sector experience in both SMEs and large corporates. To name a few, amongst her client lists, Centrica, Premier Foods, and RHM. So I'm very pleased and very proud to introduce you to Camilla to take us through the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that lovely introduction. And I have to say, that is quite a to-do list that you presented for organisations there. So I am quite relieved and pleased to be talking today primarily just about one of those topics, which is redundancy. But before we go on to redundancy, let's just talk very briefly about what organisation change is. And you will see a definition up on your screens, and that comes from the Harvard Business School. I think what it's important to realise is that organisations go through major change, we think, about once every 3 years. But within that, there's a constant swirl of minor change, and never more so than now. So what is major change? Major change could be a merger, an acquisition, redundancy, which is what we're here to talk about today. And minor change could be something like introduction of a new policy. Some would say the shift to working from home is a minor change. I would say the scale upon which we've seen that recently, that's more of a major change. So certainly as organisations, we have got used over the last 6 months to managing a huge amount of change. Change, of course, is usually characterised by a desire to change things for the better. At the moment, we are in a place where we really are having change forced upon us by external events. But that doesn't mean that we can't handle this positively. And hopefully today we can learn a little bit about how we might do that. So we probably don't want to dwell too much on 2020. I don't think it's going to go down in history as our best year ever. We started the year with Brexit. We still don't really have clarity on what that means for us. We had the floods internationally. We had the Australian bushfires. We've had conflicts between the US and Iran. We've had Black Lives Matter. We've had an awful lot going on in 2020. But I think the thing that we need to realise is the current crisis will not end with 2020. We have to find a new normal, that phrase that we're all working with and living with all the time. And we have to find a way really to deal with life the way that it is now. What has brought us to run this seminar this morning primarily is that, as we all know, the furlough scheme will end in November. Sadly, we think this will bring about wide-scale redundancies. And we would advise organisations to be planning for this now, rather than waiting until that scheme finishes in November. And before we move on to talk about redundancies, we have our first poll question. And we're really interested to know if you anticipate making redundancies before the end of 2020 in your organisation. Thank you.
So we'll leave this poll open just for 60 seconds or so. Please select an answer and we'll do an update. Okay, so we've got we've got 61% of people are anticipating making redundancies before the end of 2020. 39% saying they're not. Okay.
Thank you, Mark. That's really interesting. And I have to say, I feel quite positive about that. In my experience, I would have expected that to be a little bit higher. And we are going to talk today about some measures that businesses can consider instead of redundancies. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why that figure is not a bit higher than 61%. Okay, so let's have a think about what redundancy actually is. And I'm just going to talk you through the law here. According to the Employment Rights Act 1996, an employee is dismissed by reason of redundancy if the dismissal is wholly or mainly attributable to one of four facts. One is that the employer ceases to carry on the business in which the employee was employed. Two, the employer ceases to carry on that business in the place where the employee was employed. Three, the needs of the business for employees to carry out work of a particular kind cease or diminish. Or four, the needs of the business for employees to carry out work of a particular kind in the place where the employee was employed cease or diminish. Now, as with a lot of law, that's quite a mouthful, and we'll look at some practical examples in a moment. Before we do that, I just wanted to emphasise that redundancy and restructure are often regarded as being two sides of the same coin, but they're quite different processes which place different requirements on employers. So restructuring, for instance, might involve changing terms and conditions of employment, but redundancy is when the requirement for work has diminished to such an extent that the role no longer exists. So when does redundancy arise? And this slide does follow on from those legal definitions, which I've just shared with you. But let me take you through a few examples. So a complete closure of a business would be a redundancy situation. And sadly, I think we will see that particularly in sectors such as hospitality. What about if a business moves to a different premises? That may create redundancies if the new premises is an unreasonable proximity from where the employee lives in relation to the current place of work. We might find, for example, that an employer needs a smaller sales team as a result of decreased demand. That too would create redundancies. Or finally, an employer may decide to stop investing in support services such as training or marketing, and again, that can create redundancies. So I hope in that section I've given you a good overview of organisational change and what redundancy is. Mark, do we have any questions?
We're very quiet at the moment on the question front, so I'm sure there must be some people saving them all up.
Excellent.
What I suggest, I think what we'll do is we'll roll on to the next section and we'll build the questions up. But please do invite everybody to drop their questions. It can be quite direct about your own organisation without naming in confidence or just getting some advice, but please feel free to ask the questions and we'll roll forward.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, so now we'll talk about developing the business case and considering alternatives to redundancies. So employers are encouraged to establish a written business case for the redundancy, and actually my view would be this is required if you want to be able to defend claims of unfair dismissal at a later date. The business case really is your key document in your redundancy process. A business case will set out the reasons for the redundancies, and it helps to protect the business if employees claim that redundancies are made for unfair reasons, for example, for discriminatory reasons. Your business case will explain exactly why the redundancies have been made. And I need to emphasise here that sadly, you do need a business case if you have one redundancy or if you have 100. And of course, you know, there are organisations around which will help you to develop business cases. But what you will find in the handout section is a template business case, which you can actually use to start to develop your business case if you are going to be making redundancies. A little bit of background here in terms of what should go into that business case. It does need to be a detailed document. It can often start life as a Word document and then becomes a PowerPoint presentation if you're going to be taking a number of employees through that. And we do advise that you have facts and figures in there so that you can show that you really do have a credible case for redundancies. And this isn't just about, for example, exiting your underperforming employees. Now, as part of your business case, you need to explain what alternatives you have considered instead of making redundancies. The starting point of the law on redundancies is that redundancies should be a last resort. And we will talk shortly about consultation. And consultation is all about trying to save jobs, trying to avoid redundancies. So some ideas here of some things that you could consider doing before you move to make those redundancies. So firstly, have you put a recruitment freeze in place, and have you, for example, cut overtime? Now, you don't have to do that. There may be very good reasons for continuing to recruit in one area of your business whilst making redundancies elsewhere. But what you do need to do is explain that in the business case so that employees who are at risk of redundancy do have a full understanding of that. You may want to consider layoff or short-time working. And this is quite a little understood area of UK law. So layoff is when employees' hours are cut, and short-time working is when employees are asked to stay at home because there is no work available. Now, if you have a contract clause which allows you to do either of those things, then you can, for a certain period of time, pay statutory payments only to your employees. And they are very low payments, which can get you through a short-term decrease in demand. Now, it may be that's not what we're dealing with here. You know, COVID has had very wide-reaching and long-term implications. But if you have those contract clauses, layoff and short-time working, I do encourage you to think about whether you can use them. And if you conclude you can't use them, make sure you explain that in your business case. Changing terms and conditions of employment. I mentioned this briefly earlier. And COVID has really changed the way that we as an HR consultancy advise on changing terms and conditions. Now, this time last year, if a client had called us and said, I want to decrease salary, I want to decrease hours, that would really have raised alarm bells for us. Under what was normal circumstances, those changes are not necessarily easy to achieve. But let's just consider the following. 1 in 4 FTSE 100 companies has cut chief executive pay. I've also come across some research by a consultancy called Barning-Waddingham, which found that 2/3 of UK households has taken a pay cut since the beginning of the COVID crisis. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't have the detail as to how many of those households have experienced that pay cut due to furlough, but I did think that was quite a telling and quite a shocking figure. So can you change terms and conditions of employment, either temporarily or permanently, to save money instead of making redundancies? You can only achieve that through consultation and agreement, and that's not the topic of today's seminar, but we would encourage you to be thinking about that as a measure before redundancies. And then lastly, of course, the furlough scheme is still open. It remains open, albeit on quite different terms to that which it was originally introduced. If you have employees who were previously furloughed before the 10th of June, you can currently refurlough them, and you can also put them onto the flexible furlough scheme now. So furlough is still an option for employers. Having said that, the furlough scheme is a job retention scheme, and we wouldn't necessarily encourage you to use it just to delay making redundancies, not least because you have got some consultation requirements which are quite time consuming, which we will talk about in a moment. But I hope that is a useful explanation of some of the alternatives you can consider instead of redundancy. And I think my primary message is make sure you do this and make sure that you include this in your business case.
Okay.
And we now have another poll question. I am really interested in this one. Really interested to understand if you think that you could consider any of those alternatives to redundancy in your organisation.
Hopefully that's come up on everybody's screens. Just give it another 5 seconds and I'll close this down and we'll go look at the results. Okay. I'm going to share this with people. They can actually see. So just to surmise there, would you consider any of these alternatives to redundancy? Recruitment freeze is 29%, cutting overtime 14%, layoff or short-term working 10%, changing terms and conditions 43%, other 5%.
Okay, thank you everybody for your contributions. I think it's really interesting to see 43% would consider changing terms and conditions. Really does demonstrate to me how life has changed over the past 6 months. And I think, you know, employees are actually pretty open to having their terms and conditions changed. I think employers are realistic that the alternative is really not much better. And, you know, I'm aware of a number of organisations who have implemented pay decreases of between 10 and 30% for either groups of employees or all employees, and that usually works on a sliding scale. So the higher paid employees would take more of a pay cut. And most organisations would agree to review that after a set period of time. We've not got to that set period of time yet, so I can't give any insight onto whether I think pay will rebuild in those organisations which have cut it. But thank you, really interesting for me as an HR consultant.
So we've got some questions. Yeah, we've got some questions in now. So Amanda asks, can you start handover of work during the consultation period? Okay, Amanda, thank you. That's a really good question, and we will touch briefly on this in the next section. I will answer it now. Broadly, well, basically the answer is no, that's pretty risky. The purpose of a consultation period is to avoid redundancies, and if you start handing over work during the consultation period, it's a pretty good indication that that decision has already been made. So apologies, I know that's not a very practical answer, but that is the answer that I have. Okay. If you reduce terms and conditions, are you expected to increase them again at a later date? Yeah, I think I've just touched on that. So a good question probably came in before I made that comment. That really depends upon the agreement which you put in place with your employees. And what I would say is employees will probably agree more readily if you suggest there is a point in time at which you will review the situation. I wouldn't recommend promising to increase terms and conditions because you simply don't know what your business situation is going to be. And it may be that if you promise to increase, you're then either back into another consultation exercise to maintain the decrease, or you're having to look at redundancies. What if there isn't time to develop, you want to get on with a process and there isn't time to develop a detailed business case? Yeah, again, really good question. I think you have got to do the best you can, and within that business case you have got to explain why you've not been able to do any better. Hope that answers that question. I mean, but I think you've got to be really honest with yourself as an organisation about why you don't have time to develop that business case, because the law does expect you to prioritise that activity. Having said that, I think we are at a time of crisis, and as long as we can explain why we haven't been able to develop a detailed business case, a tribunal will hopefully look sympathetically on that. We simply don't have the cases coming out of the COVID age yet to know if that's the case. Okay, and so I'm just reading a couple of questions here. I think Amanda's added recruitment freeze in addition to redundancies. That would be a combination. How does that, not instead of redundancies? So how do you balance that out if you need to restructure? Apologies, Mark, was the question if you need to... This is going back to Amanda's question at the beginning about balancing out workloads in a consultation period. Because if there's a recruitment freeze as well as an addition to the redundancies going ahead, there's got to be some way to balance the workload. Is there any criteria can you justify handing out work or reallocating the load during a period of consultation?
Yeah, I mean, Amanda, apologies, I think I'm probably not going to give you a full answer to this question. You know, there's always judgment required in these situations, and I think in order to answer that, we would have to look very carefully about the specific circumstances of the case. What I would say is that if there is a huge chunk of work that still needs to be done, is there actually a redundancy situation? If it's simply about needing to save costs, is there a different way to achieve that? But I think we would need to look at the actual business case and how we are planning to reallocate work to really answer that properly. More than happy if you want to drop me an email afterwards and we can have a brief conversation about that. My email address will come up at the end.
Question from Di. What is the trend on redundancy policies, enhanced versus statutory?
Okay, so that will depend on size of business. So I will be honest, most of the work that we do is with small and medium-sized businesses. Overwhelmingly, they are paying statutory only. Those at the slightly bigger end may look to do something extra, maybe putting between 25 and 50% more on top of statutory redundancy, but that is quite rare. Bigger businesses, and I have got a background, as Mark said, in more corporate businesses, they are much more likely to have contractual redundancy policies with enhanced terms, which you will have to operate to.
Have we found that companies have reduced their policy in light of what could be happening?
No, we haven't found that at all. And actually, if they've got a contractual redundancy policy, that's actually quite a long-winded exercise. And the time and the upset that will cause is probably going to sort of override the benefits, the cost-saving benefit that you would get from changing that policy. No, I've not had one single experience of that, Mark, but I am just one HR consultant. I can't talk for my many colleagues around the country.
Okay, very good. Okay, I think if we move on to the next subject, that's good timing.
Okay, so we have started to touch upon some of this, but I think we can bring it all together a little bit more thoroughly. So we're going to look at how we put together a fair redundancy process and selection criteria, and also talk about redundancy pay. So the redundancy process. So firstly, you need to identify the pool of employees which are at risk of redundancy. Now, a pool can be as small as one, and we would refer to that as a unique redundancy. And that's where there is only one person doing a particular role. And in small businesses, that's not that unusual. However, we do also need to consider if anybody is doing a similar role or an interchangeable role, and if they should go into the same pool. So the starting point for a pool is considering what kind of work is ceasing or diminishing, and then looking at which employees carry out that work and looking at that quite creatively. Sometimes the obvious answer is not necessarily the answer which an employment tribunal later down the line would accept. As I said, we do need to also look at those employees doing similar or interchangeable jobs. And then we need to find a way of selecting between them, let's assume, for example, you've got a sales team of 6 and you need to let 3 go. You need to find a way of deciding which 3 you will retain and which 3 will unfortunately be made redundant. And the selection criteria you need will link back to your business case. It will depend upon the objective needs of the business. And we need to take care not to include any subjective criteria, which are based on opinion and not supported by facts. And a good example of that would be attitude. It's really quite difficult to evidence a poor attitude or indeed a good attitude in an organisation without those views being really rather subjective. So common selection criteria would include attendance, length of service, disciplinary records. If you have an appraisal system, it can really come into its own at this point, albeit recognising this is probably not why you introduced it. An appraisal system will give you objective evidence of performance. You need to be really careful when looking at selection criteria that it's not discriminatory by mistake. So, for instance, including length of service can be a bit dangerous because it may disadvantage younger employees. And if you include attendance record, then you're going to need to be careful to discount any absences which relate to pregnancy. or indeed disability. Just excuse me for one moment. And up on the slide there, for those of you who haven't seen a selection matrix before, I have put just a very simple template, which is actually taken from Investors in People. We would usually recommend that something a little bit more sophisticated is developed, but I thought that would just give you an idea of what the format would look like. Consultation. Again, we have talked a little bit about consultation. There are quite different requirements for consultation based upon how many employees you are actually looking to lose from your organisation. So you will see individual consultation is defined as when you have less than 20 redundancies proposed in a 90-day period. If you've got more than 20, then you've got different requirements around length of consultation, and I've noted those in the table for you. With collective consultation, you also need to consult with employee representatives, and if you don't have a trade union, you will have to elect those representatives, and you also have a responsibility to inform the Secretary of State. So in some ways, because you've got so much prescription with collective consultation, it's actually a lot easier to know what to do. Individual consultation is much less prescribed, but it does need to be reasonable and it does need to be meaningful. So what we would usually recommend would be 2 to 3 meetings across a consultation period with an individual employee. And if the process is run well and you have no major objections raised during that, you can usually get through that in about 3 weeks. But I need to emphasise there that if there is a reason to extend it, then you really would, I really would recommend that you do that to avoid any successful claims later on. So the topics for consultation, and it is slightly different depending on whether you're doing individual or collective consultation. But broadly speaking, if you are talking to individuals at risk of redundancy about all of the matters noted on this slide, you will not go far wrong. And what I'd like you to take away from this slide is the use of the word proposed all the way through. And this relates back to our question about whether or not we can hand over during a consultation period. Until the redundancies are confirmed at the end of the consultation period, these changes to your organisation are only proposed. And we need to be discussing with employees ways to avoid the redundancies. We need to be discussing with employees any suggestions that they put forward as alternatives. Employees are entitled to suggest to us that we may restructure the organisation in a different way, and we need to seriously consider that. We can say no, there's absolutely no obligation to implement any changes suggested by the employee, but we do have to seriously consider them. We then have the matter of alternative employment within the organisation. And if there is suitable alternative employment in your organisation for an employee at risk of redundancy, it must be offered to the employee at risk. But of course, that begs the question, well, what is suitable alternative employment? Well, the starting point for that is to look at the replacement role objectively and look at how similar or how different it might be to the existing role. But it then also requires the individual employee to find it suitable based on their own circumstances. So, for example, if you have the same role but at a different location which the employee cannot travel to, the employee may deem that is not suitable alternative employment and therefore would be entitled to a redundancy payment. If there is suitable alternative employment and the employee wishes to pursue that, they will then be entitled to a 4-week trial in the suitable alternative. And if it doesn't work out, they would be entitled to their redundancy payment at the end of that. And as well as considering suitable alternative employment, we also just need to look at any internal vacancies which may exist in the organisation. So you may have vacancies, let's go back to our scenario where you're making your sales team redundant, you may have vacancies in finance. If that's the case, I do urge you to share those vacancies with your at-risk employees. You know, your view may be, well, how can a salesperson go into a finance role? And in that scenario, that's not suitable alternative employment. They would not automatically transfer to it. But they should be entitled to an opportunity to apply for it, and you can then consider whether or not you should take them through the interview process. And really important as well to continue to give vacancies to employees all the way through this process. So you might get to the end of consultation and your redundant employees may be working out their notice period, which could be between 3 and 6 months. And all of the advice from top employment lawyers at the moment is, in the COVID age, with employment going down, just keep on talking to your employees who are redundant about vacancies, so keep on issuing those vacancy lists. So we're now on to redundancy pay, which again we've already had a question on. So all employees with 2+ years service in the UK are entitled to a statutory redundancy payment. There's a really good calculator for this on the Gov website. You can just plug the details in and it will shoot out your redundancy payment. But just for your awareness, an employee will get half a week's pay for every year they've been employed between the ages of 18 and 22, 1 week's pay for every year they've been employed between the ages of 22 and 40, and 1.5 weeks pay for every year they've been employed between the ages of 41 upwards. Currently, a week's pay is capped at £538, and the total redundancy payment is capped at £16,140. And redundancy pay, as you may be aware, is paid tax-free. So that's statutory. We've touched on contractual redundancy pay. Do check if you have a redundancy policy, but not only that, do check what the practice has been in the past. If the practice has been to make enhanced payments on a consistent basis, even if that is not written down, that may be contractual based on custom and practice. So I do urge you to understand that. So that's your redundancy pay element, but there are some other costs that you also need to think about. One is your notice payment. So every employee will have a notice period in their contract. They can either stay on and work that, or if you have the right contract clause, that notice could be paid in lieu. So for instance, if they're on a month's notice, they could leave on the day the redundancy is confirmed and be paid that month as a lump sum instead. Excuse me. Employees will also be entitled to accrued but untaken holiday, and that can be quite a cost, so that's worth looking at. And there are some implications here for employees who are on furlough. It is absolutely valid to be consulting with employees whilst they're on furlough, and that's usually done by a video call. You need to be aware that notice and holiday pay for employees on furlough needs to be topped up to 100%. That became very clear in law only about 3 weeks ago, and the whole employment law and HR profession breathed a sigh of relief at that. So the organisation is responsible for topping that up, and there's an important distinction here. If your employee is remaining in the business on furlough whilst they see their notice period out, then you can make use of the coronavirus job retention scheme and claim through that for 80% of the notice costs. If, however, they are being paid in lieu of notice, then you as the employer will be liable for that whole payment. So that's something that's really worth understanding at the get-go of this. Just a couple of other costs to touch upon. Some organisations may want to consider outplacement support in the form of career coaching or CV and interview guidance. I have to say that's becoming increasingly unlikely at the moment. We're not seeing very much of that. And you may also want to agree with your redundant employees that you will give them a reference and what that reference will say. So I hope that section has been useful and put a bit more meat on the bones in terms of some of the questions that were asked. Mark, have we got any questions coming in here?
Yeah, so right, where do you start? Do you have to go through the whole process regardless of the employee's service record?
Really good question. And I toyed with the idea of whether to cover this in the presentation. So what I would say is if an employee has got less than 2 years service, there is potentially an opportunity not to follow this full process. And the reason for that is because employees need 2 years service to qualify for unfair dismissal claims. So the risks are much slimmer. So pragmatically and commercially, organisations do often choose not to go through the full process with employees with less than 2 years service. However, I would caveat that by saying there is no qualifying service requirement for a discrimination claim. So if you are likely to get discrimination allegations, if you make somebody with less than 2 years service redundant without going through the full process, we would advise that you do build more process in. Again, it's a very sort of case-specific question, but if you've got employees with less than 2 years service, definitely worth taking advice on that point.
Claire asks, can you enforce pay in lieu of notice even when it's not in the contract?
Not really, but you can seek to agree something with your employees. Again, I would probably suggest that you take advice on that and just quite how you initiate that conversation. So you can't force it, but you can agree it. And to be honest, most employers will be agreeable to it.
Okay. Are either party able to, or should they record stream for consultation videos or other meetings?
Apologies, Mark, should they?
Are either party able to, or should they record their consultation, i.e. video calls and meetings? Yeah.
Is that a question about recording the meetings? Yeah. Again, this is becoming increasingly commonplace. It shouldn't be done without the consent of both parties. So if you wish for your meetings not to be recorded, then you need to make that very specifically clear at the start of the meeting. And when we prepare scripts for these types of meetings, we will also build that into the script. I have to say, though, it's becoming increasingly commonplace for both parties to either be totally comfortable or sort of grudgingly accepting that the technology exists and therefore we should make use of it. And particularly where wide-scale redundancies are being made. On a practical note, notes need to be taken of all of these meetings. I can't tell you how much easier that is if you have a recording of the meeting. So our advice has changed on this point, actually. A year or so ago, it was something we were quite against, mainly because we just feel that sometimes people do say things in meetings, particularly in stressful meetings, which things come out wrong and you don't want them on record, but actually now we're seeing wide-scale redundancies. In terms of the practicalities of this, recordings can actually be really useful.
Okay, puts things into context.
Yeah.
Jack, just follows up your comments earlier. Why aren't employers paying for outplacement support? Is it purely due to cost?
I think it's purely due to cost, is the feedback that I'm getting. And again, worth emphasising that I am working mainly with small and medium-sized businesses. I would imagine that larger businesses who can make use of economies of scale and get some good deals with the outplacement providers will probably be more likely to be making use of that.
I need to ask,
it's quite expensive, outplacement.
Yeah. There's two different versions. There's one-on-one or there's technology platforms, isn't there? And it depends. Yeah. I need to ask, can you please clarify if your employee is on furlough during the notice period? Did you say the latest rules are you cannot claim furlough payments for the overlap?
So if they're on furlough during their notice period, you can claim under the furlough scheme. If you're paying in lieu of notice, you can't claim furlough monies for the lump sum, which represents the pay in lieu of notice.
Okay.
So the cheaper option is to keep them on, the cheaper option for the business.
Yeah, okay. Can you ask someone to work their notice where others are taking pile-on?
Absolutely, yeah. Business specific, depends on the particular circumstances of that individual case. Perfectly valid to require one job role to work out their notice and others not to.
Okay. Do you have to pay benefits as part of the pay in lieu of notice payment when pay in lieu is not in the contract?
That will depend entirely on the construct of the contract and what the rules of the benefits scheme say. It's likely that you won't have to, but we would need to review contracts and schemes of the rules of the various schemes on that, and actually also look at past practice, what has been done in the past, what's become the norm.
Okay. One more before we move on to the final section. My team is a mix of perm staff and contractors. Can you make perm staff redundant and also keep on the contractors?
I don't like it, but if you can justify it in your business case, it may be feasible. But I think you open yourself up to a risk of unfair dismissal on the basis that you haven't looked at all of the other measures that you could have looked at. But if you've got a good business case for it, it's not impossible.
Okay. That would need to be documented and shared with all parties.
Yeah, absolutely. Your business case would need to explain the measures that you've looked at to avoid redundancies, why you've put some in place and why you haven't put others in place, for example, why you've chosen to retain some contractors over your redundant employees, and obviously this is a confidential document, so you wouldn't put names in there. You would put the positions that those contractors are in.
So you could potentially ring fence a specific project or something and say they're here to deliver on that project or something.
Yeah.
Okay. If we go on to the fourth topic.
Yes. Should we continue on to the fourth topic, Mark? Okay. So in many ways, this is the most important area for the sort of ongoing viability and survival of the business. But it is often the area which gets forgotten, how you retain and motivate the survivors of this process. And I have to say that, you know, as HR professionals, we ourselves are guilty of this. We get through the redundancy process, we all breathe a sigh of relief and think that's it, it's over. And we forget that we've got some rather weary survivors left behind, who we need to kind of reinvigorate and rejuvenate to continue to run our business for us. And there's an interesting concept called the psychological contract. And you'll see a definition of the psychological contract in front of you, and that's taken from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And this recognises that although the contract of employment forms the legal basis for the obligations between employer and employee, it's actually people's perceptions of the employer's obligations which forms the true relationship between employer and employee. And this is really intangible, and people's perceptions of their employer's obligations are often based upon actions which have happened in the past, even towards other employees, or expectations that employees bring from other businesses. Psychological contract can be based on employees' sense of fairness and trust, and their sense and belief that the employer is honouring the deal which employer and employee have between them. So you can probably guess what I'm coming on to, which is when organisations are making redundancies, particularly wide-scale redundancies, no matter how rational this seems to the employer, this can appear to employees to be a serious breach of that psychological contract, and it can cause, you know, distrust, really bad feeling towards the employer, and can result then in low productivity, which is absolutely what you don't need as an employer at this point of organisational change. Many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the change curve, which is derived from the work of Kubler-Ross. They actually wrote about grief to begin with, but this curve has been taken to now explain the internal emotional journey that individuals will typically experience when they're dealing with change and transition, and this can relate as much to the workplace as in your personal life. So very briefly taking you through this, shock and denial, of course, is when individuals just cannot believe this is happening in the organisation and are feeling that everything was better as it was. Anger is the next stage. Often a scapegoat will be found in the organisation. The chief executive can find himself very unpopular at this point, even if he has previously been a well-liked figure, he or she, I ought to say. Depression comes next, and this really is the lowest point of the curve when anger begins to wean off. And the realisation that the change is genuine hits people. Morale at this stage can be really low, and performance, again, at its lowest point. Now, the good news is that eventually, you know, most people do move out of this and they move on to understanding and acceptance. They begin to see this change is real, and they think to themselves, right, I've got to get on with this. Let's try and see some positives, and a more enthusiastic mood begins to emerge. And eventually we get to that final stage, which is moving on, where the change just becomes part of the way we are. By this point, there usually have been a few casualties along the way. A few people have moved on and outwards of the organisation. But by the time everybody who's left has got to moving on, you are usually in a good place. The problem, of course, with the age we're living in at the moment is that this is not at all a linear journey for us. And I think today is a case in point. I think perhaps, you know, a couple of days ago, we were all moving into the understanding acceptance stage of the pandemic. We're now expecting an announcement from Boris Johnson later on today, and who knows, I suspect we will be back at least to to depression for a couple of days, possibly even in shock and denial, depending on what he has to say. But the key point really is that different communication strategies are required for each stage of this change journey. So when individuals are in shock and denial, often employees don't feel like they have enough information, and this is especially the case with redundancy because all of the consultation is focused on those individuals who are at risk. And of course, because we have confidentiality to consider, we can't necessarily share all of that information with those employees who are left. But as soon as we can, we would advise that you give as much information as is possible and give individuals who are left the opportunity to absorb that information. When the anger and depression stage kicks in, people are often feeling suspicious and sceptical and really frustrated. So we would advise then that you create forums for individuals to be able to ask questions so that their issues can really be properly addressed. As we get on to understanding and acceptance, people are beginning to feel that actually this change may not be so bad, so we need to be offering further opportunities for them to feel that way, really capitalise upon that positive feeling, perhaps looking at, ordinarily it would be training and development. I recognise that we don't necessarily have the funds for that at the moment, but perhaps looking at some form of informal employee forum which allows people to share ideas as to how the change can be built upon. And then eventually we get on to moving on and commitment, which is where we are all focusing on the future. And at this stage, we would recommend some kind of celebration that we've been through that change journey and we've broken down the barriers and really made a success of the situation. So just to summarise, I think the key point when you're looking at management of your situation post-redundancy is really all about communication and transparency. You can't over-communicate at this point, and share as much information as you can, recognising that you can't share the details of somebody's individual consultation situation. Because of the COVID situation that we're in, now more than ever, we would also recommend that you look at the wider context. So people are on a journey with COVID, which is not just about the workplace. So as well as going through change at work, they're going through change at home. They're being told that their social circle is limited. They may not have access easily to the support, the people they would lean upon for support. So recognise that, and recognise as well that there's some really quite worrying statistics on mental health out there. I was talking to the chief exec of an occupational health provider who we work with, and he said that 40% of his key client base are reporting an increase in stress-related absence. That's really quite concerning, both from a wider mental health perspective, but also from an organisational perspective, because that's going to have an impact on productivity levels in your organisation. So recognise that and look at how you can address that. For example, employee assistance programs are doing quite well at the moment. They are quite a low cost benefit which can be provided to employees, a confidential helpline which gives them an outlet to address their concerns and can take some of the pressure off your business as well. I think it probably goes without saying that one of the key points around managing your survivors is to manage your redundancy process as well, because people will talk, and if you can send those people who are leaving your organisation away feeling positive, they will really be important people for you in management of the survivors, because they're probably still talking to them. And lastly, really, give yourselves a break, because managing these processes is not easy. So make sure that when you're thinking about communicating to your employees and supporting their mental health, that you are really giving yourself that self-care as well. You're leading these processes and you need to see everybody else through it. And our great hope is that if the situation is managed well, your business will come out of this situation we're in at the moment surviving and maybe even thriving. And I hope what I've spoken to you about today will give you some tips as to how you may be able to achieve that. Thank you.
That's excellent. We've got one very quick question, I think, before we just wrap up. Are there any particular tactics, or are there any particular, you find certain employers focus on managing current survivors? I would have thought that's something that small businesses are more adept to. businesses?
Yeah, interesting. Small businesses are more adept to it, but I think it's also easier for employees in small businesses to really see the sort of frustrations which people in leadership positions might be feeling, which we would rather they didn't see. I think, you know, there's no rocket science to this. It's about communication. It's about allowing employees to come and talk to you should they need to. It's about checking in regularly, particularly with home working. Maybe as leaders in your business, diarising calls to really make sure that they happen. It sounds silly, but just prioritising emails that come in. You know, if an employee emails you with a question which relates to the change which you've just put in place, just do your utmost to respond to that within a couple of hours, even though your workload is probably really heavy and it's tempting to leave it till the end of the week. So I don't think there's any rocket science or anything particularly clever about this. I think it's just about thinking about how you would want to be treated and treating those people in that right way.
A really good perspective. If you can just click us on to the final slide and we'll wrap up. So, I mean, thank you very much for everyone participating in the polls. A reminder, obviously, that in the handout section on the webinar, you can download some of the copy of the presentation, some other documents to support you there. We'll leave the webinar open for 5 minutes or so after the end of the presentation for you to do that. Please feel free to contact Camilla or myself directly. We've equally got a remind you about the donation. It'd be much appreciated for Action for Children. It is difficult times. It's even more difficult for those who haven't got any control over their incomes and where they sleep at night. So that's much appreciated. Even £10 will make a big difference. You'll be given a follow-up when you log out of the presentation or the webinar. You'll be invited to participate in a brief survey just to give us some feedback on the event, find out what sections that are most appropriate, which gave you the most information. But thank you for all your questions. It's been very inclusive. I hope people have benefited from that. Any other points from yourself, Camilla?
No, I don't think so. Just to thank everybody for their participation, and I think particularly those polls as an HR consultant really gave me some insight. So thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Camilla, for yourself and all your efforts.
Thank you.
Camilla and I will turn our mics off and turn the videos off and leave the webinar presentation open so you can download from the handout section now for the next 5 minutes. But thank you very much for your time and joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.